Okay, so this is where we left off last time, talking about the social standing of African Americans. We talked about how after the Civil War, there was this fear from white people about changing racial dynamics of the country. So they established separation or Jim Crow laws to try and segregate people into different accommodations, different housing, different neighborhoods, different, no access to equal education, any of those kind of things, right? And of course, this led to two different types of opportunities. One that was free and open access for white people, and one that was hampered by institutional discrimination for people of color. So when it comes to, I think we kind of left off here last time talking about the Great Migration, the Harlem Renaissance. So, the Great Migration after World War One brought thousands of people to the north, um, and led to what's called the Harlem Renaissance, where people fought back against the racist script that people of color were um, incapable of creating deep thought, art, culture, since they were segregated or separated from mainstream white society. They created their own music, their own film, their own books, their own poetry, and it was considered this renaissance, meaning it really countered those stereotypes that people of color were mentally, socially, in every other way inferior, right? It really showed that no, these groups are just as intelligent, if anything, profound in the way to, suffer such hardship and still be able to turn that into beautiful art and expression. So that's what the Harlem Renaissance is known for. In 1954, we had the Brown versus Board of Education. I mentioned briefly in class how there was a Westminster case that preceded it. So, close to us. But Brown versus Board ended school segregation, right? And of course, in the 1960s, you have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And like I recommended in class, I recommend you watch the film Selma if you want to understand more about the Voting Rights Act and why it was necessary. And just to mention, something we'll talk about later when we talk about voting systems and politics is how some protections of the Voting Rights Act were stripped a couple years ago by the Supreme Court, who decided that they were no longer necessary. And what has happened as a result of, loosening the restrictions of the Voting Rights Act is this proliferation all over the U.S. of voter ID card legislation, which has marginalized hundreds of thousands of people of color from voting. So we'll talk about that later as well. So when it comes to statistically, today, people are still disadvantaged if they're African American. They have below average incomes. The poverty rate for African Americans is nearly 3 times that of the white poverty rate. The college completion rate is well below the national average, as you can see in the table above. And the loss of factory jobs contributed to high unemployment. So that deindustrialization that happened in these communities, again, we'll talk about when we talk about the economy and work and globalization. A lot of these factories were moved to places around the world where they could pay workers less. And so what happened was this removed the economic floor beneath, African Americans, losing the opportunities to actually support their families, and nothing came in to replace it in a lot of inner city areas. So when it comes to the social standing of Asian Americans, Asian Americans are people that have historical ties to dozens of Asian nations. The largest number in this country have roots to China, the Philippines, India, South Korea, and Japan. So immigration from China and Japan began with the California Gold Rush of 1849. But once the economy slowed, whites pressured legislators and courts to bar Asians from certain types of work. So, and of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Made it so that men that were here working on the railroads were not able to bring their wives over and reunite their families, effectively cutting off, migration from certain areas. So when it comes to more present day social standing, during World War II, Obviously, an executive order, I keep trying to remind people how important executive orders are, that Roosevelt signed an Executive Order 9066, that relocated 100,000 Japanese Americans to military style camps, what we call internment camps. Um, there's George Takei, who's he was on the original Star Trek, and he's kind of this famous guy, but he's out there really talking about this right now because he was placed in an internment camp in his own childhood. He has memories of growing up through this kind of imprisonment situation and how it, economically and socially devastated his parents. So if you want to know more about that, I suggest you look him up. He's given some really great interviews that you could find on YouTube about it. Okay, so part of the changing status was citizenship was granted to Chinese Americans in 1943 and to Japanese Americans in 1952. That was not very long ago, right? So this shows how much the stereotypes led to unfair treatment. So by the 80s, Asians were called a model minority based on their cultural commitment to study and hard work. So, that kind of changes people's perceptions of Asian Americans. When it comes to the social standing in 2012, this was the fastest increasing racial or ethnic category of the US population, with most of the increase coming from immigration. So all categories of Asian Americans now have above average income and education, but some have poverty rates that are close to or even above the national average. So calling Asian Americans or assuming all Asian Americans fall into this model minority standard actually can be more marginalizing because then it ignores and obscures the poverty that a lot of Asians still live within. Okay, so then the social standing of Hispanic Americans. This is the US's largest minority group with 53 million people, or just about 17% of the total population. Census says that 34 million are of Mexican origin, 5 million Puerto Rican, 2 million Cuban. So there's really no one Latino culture. Obviously, we talked about this in class, how pan-ethnic racial groups try and shove everybody into one, box and try and label them, just like with the pan-ethnic category of Asian. These are very different cultures that are being kind of squished together. So people try to call it Latino culture, but there are various variations within each culture that makes up what's determined to be Latino. So when it comes to overall standing in the US is below average. So Cuban Americans have more education and higher incomes, but Mexican Americans have the lowest relative ranking. You see that there's a language barrier that leads to limited job opportunities and higher dropout rates in school. And so this group represents about 10% of eligible voters in 2012. So the language barrier is a big one because if you don't get a good education, it's difficult to get a good job. So that's something that's very important to focus on. When it comes to the social standing of Arab Americans, immigration from many nations has created a culturally diverse Arab American population. Some are Muslims, some are Christians, some have other faiths, some speak Arabic, some don't, some speak Farsi. Not all Arab Americans choose to maintain the traditions of their homeland, and many have lived in the US for decades or even for generations. So Arab Americans represent 1% of the population in the US. Most are from Lebanon, Egypt, and Syria. When it comes to the social standing of Arab Americans, they have an average income, but also a higher poverty rate. They're highly educated as a minority group. But of course, since 2001, there's been increased number of hate crimes for Arab Americans. Many feel they're subject to ethnic profiling that threatens their civil liberties. And of course, what's going on right now with the quote unquote Muslim ban could be interpreted as part of that. Okay, so prejudice, what is it? Prejudice is any rigid or unfounded generalization about an entire category of people. So a stereotype is an exaggerated description applied to every person in some category. And racism is the assertion that people of one race are less worthy or even biologically inferior to others. So this is the most serious example of prejudice. When we try to understand prejudice today, we have to look at what's called institutional racism. Institutional racism is racism at work in the operation of social institutions. So when institutional racism involves an organization with a lot of power, bringing about change can be difficult. There are two key factors in the causes of prejudice: personality factors and societal factors, right? So personality factors means maybe someone is better at playing basketball than another person, or maybe someone is better at writing than another person. That could cause some sort of inequality, which could lead to prejudice. But societal factors are much stronger in determining worth and value when it comes to race, class, gender, all those kind of things. Multiculturalism refers to educational programs designed to recognize cultural diversity in the US and to promote respect for all cultural traditions. It claims that society has sought to minimize cultural diversity and that institutions have a Eurocentric bias. So liberals and conservatives differ over how much stress we should place on a single national identity and how much we should highlight differences between people. So if assimilation is trying to get everyone to be the same, pluralism or multiculturalism is the opposite. It's respecting differences. So discrimination is a little bit different than prejudice. While prejudice is an attitude, discrimination is a matter of actions. So discrimination involves the unequal treatment of various categories of people. Discrimination can be positive or negative. So you could get, positive discrimination would be considered privilege, right? So institutional discrimination is built into the operation of social institutions, including the economy, schools, and the legal system, something we'll be talking about throughout the class. When it comes to affirmative action, prejudice and discrimination reinforce each other, maintaining social inequality over time. So affirmative action policies seek to break the circle of prejudice and discrimination by giving people opportunities from groups that were historically marginalized, like women or people of color. So the US courts continue to refine and define affirmative action policies, but there's a lot of stigma against these policies because they're considered to be quote unquote reverse racism, which isn't really a thing. Okay, so when it comes to how different groups look at this, right, how conservatives look at this, they argue that people are responsible for their own social standing. So if you're poor, it's because of the choices you made in your life. If you're not doing well, even though you're a minority population, you're just not trying hard enough. They argue that cultural differences set some parts of the population apart from others, but they think that a free society must be an unequal society, right? Because that's going to motivate people. They also argue that affirmative action operates as a reverse discrimination. So I'm going to show you a quick clip about that claim and why it's not very justified.
This video is part of a series for Everyday Feminism, a website dedicated to helping you stand up to and break down everyday oppression. When I think of topics that I'd want to discuss with ultra-conservative family members, affirmative action is probably at the bottom of my list, right next to police brutality and immigration reform. I'm sure we've all heard comments from people before saying things like, slavery ended a long time ago, so why are black people still reaping the benefits? Or affirmative action discriminates against white people. Isn't that reverse racist? Affirmative action is often accused of being a racist system, and this is based on the assumption that we lived in a post-racist society, meaning racism is no longer an issue in the United States. If racism is no longer a problem, then why do we need programs that only benefit racial minority groups? Doesn't that exclude hardworking white people from jobs, schools, and financial aid in lieu of less deserving people of color? Let's break down this troublesome myth. First, I want to give you guys a little history lesson about affirmative action, namely what we don't normally think about as affirmative action. The period directly following World War II was a period of huge economic growth for the United States, as well as an expansion of the middle class. Thanks to the GI Bill, which was a bill passed that gave a range of benefits to returning veterans, many U.S. citizens were afforded upward mobility for the first time. Recipients of the GI Bill received reduced cost mortgages, low interest loans so they could start their own businesses, free or reduced cost tuition and housing for universities and trade schools, as well as 1 year of unemployment compensation. Between 1944 and 1949, almost 9 million veterans received $4 billion in unemployment compensation, and by 1962, $50 billion in loans, which is a lot. Another large source of assistance provided to Americans post-World War II was the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA. The goals of the FHA were to improve housing standards and conditions, finance homes at affordable rates, and increase the size of the housing market. Because of this government agency, homeownership increased between 1934 and 2001 from 40% to 70%. The GI Bill and the Federal Housing Administration are arguably some of the largest affirmative action programs in the US, but they aren't perceived that way because they predominantly benefited white Americans. When programs and policies largely benefit white people, they generally aren't considered affirmative action. Much like the way financial aid and tax breaks received by middle and upper class people aren't perceived as welfare. Because of the FHA and the GI Bill, masses of white veterans were able to buy houses, start their own businesses, and gain access to higher education, which up until that point had been a luxury only afforded to a few upper class elites. The thing about the GI Bill and the FHA is that they were extremely racist institutions. When World War II ended, veterans of color experienced numerous obstacles in trying to receive the same benefits as white veterans. Black soldiers were dishonorably discharged at suspiciously high rates in comparison to white soldiers. This made them completely ineligible for any of the benefits of the GI Bill. The soldiers of color who weren't dishonorably discharged were largely excluded from job training programs for careers in high-paying fields. Instead, black veterans were channeled into low-paying, traditionally designated black jobs. On top of this, segregation was still in place, excluding black veterans from attending the best universities. And unfortunately, the few historically black colleges were ill-equipped, underfunded, and unable to enroll the 70,000 black veterans who returned from the war. The educational gap between white Americans and Americans of color increased greatly during this time period. The Federal Housing Administration was also unapologetically in favor of racial segregation and actively banned people of color from moving into white neighborhoods. If a person of color did happen to gain access to one of these neighborhoods, then the property value of the entire neighborhood went down. In a process called redlining, neighborhoods with high populations of people of color were denied loans and considered high-risk investments. During this time period, only about 2% of federally insured home loans were given to African Americans. Because of the decreased property values of communities of color, these neighborhoods were less likely to receive funds and public services and often fell into decay. The problem with discussing affirmative action as if racism is a problem of the distant past is that we ignore the very real effects that racist systems still have on people of color. So when I hear people bemoaning the injustice of affirmative action against white people, they fail to account for the very long history of racism that has elevated white Americans and given many of them the benefits that they receive today. Affirmative action helped millions of white families gain access to higher education, receive high-paying jobs, and buy homes for the first time ever. We can't ignore the fact that entire racial groups were denied the same privilege. In 2015, we still see a large gap between the distribution of wealth between white homes and homes belonging to people of color. Residential segregation in neighborhoods exists as a direct result of these policies. Large gaps in education and wage earnings between white Americans and non-white Americans are still largely prevalent. When we connect the injustices that people of color experienced in the past with the injustices that still plague them today, it becomes more than just a mere coincidence. I think much of the time claims of affirmative action being discriminatory are used to invalidate the successes of people of color, but also an excuse to maintain the status quo. White people have had their place at the top for a very long time, and sometimes when we make room for minority groups, it can be perceived as something being taken away from them. With the creation of affirmative action programs, spaces in society that have historically been reserved for white Americans are meant to be made more inclusive of people of color, so that everyone can have an equal and fair chance. If you're part of a group that's benefited from discrimination in the past and you're used to receiving more than your fair share of opportunities, it can be easy to view affirmative action as something that's harmful to you. But it's important to remember that affirmative action is merely a response to the discrimination that already exists and has existed for centuries against people of color in the United States. Affirmative action is not meant to discriminate against white people. It's meant to reverse the discrimination that's denied people of color an equal place in society for hundreds of years. Anyway, thank you for watching this video.
Okay, so when it comes to what liberals argue, they argue that society and government matter. So societal factors are the main reason for inequality. They argue that prejudice, discrimination, and institutional bias are all at play. So the responsibility lies in the structure of power and privilege in the larger society, not on the shoulders of the individual. They argue that government action is the favored solution, and they argue that affirmative action is a policy that has worked, right? Because it's increased the hiring of women and minorities, and having women and minorities go to higher education institutions, which it was the point of the programs. So it was successful in their view. Radicals argue that fundamental change is needed, that there's, two ways to solve the problem of racial and ethnic inequality. Attack the source of all inequality, which is the structure and maintenance of capitalism itself, which causes us to live within a hierarchy where some people have better access to privileges than others. So it causes stratification. And also eliminating the concept of race, which provides an ideological basis for dividing people. If we know there's no biological basis for race, then why do we still use it, right? If we know ethnicity is a lot better at actually defining differences between groups of people, then why do we still use race as that division, right? So, there's different views from different groups about what should be done about these kind of issues with inequality.